The dragon's dying scream shattered through dimensions at 3:47 a.m., and Elara's eyes snapped open like gunshots. Every cell in her immortal body convulsed as the psychic wave hit her consciousness. This wasn't just pain. This was the death cry of magic itself, bleeding through the astral plane like a wound that would never heal. In her crystalline tower, surrounded by artifacts that had witnessed the birth of stars, the High Elf leader felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 millennia of existence: absolute bone-deep terror. For 63 years, the United States government had tortured a living god in the concrete bowels of Area 51. Tonight, that god was calling for help, and the High Elves of Eldoria were about to commit the most dangerous act of war in recorded history. The Chronicles of Erthos had warned of this moment, when the elemental fabric of reality would tear, when ancient magic would bleed through the cracks of a sterile world built on lies. But warnings meant nothing when Ignis, the last elder dragon, was screaming his soul apart in a cage designed by creatures who believed magic was just another weapon to dissect. Elara's fingers clutched the arms of her throne, carved from a single piece of starfall crystal that had been cooling for 10,000 years. The psychic echo rolled through her mind again, and this time she could taste the metallic tang of suppression fields, smell the sterile air of technological prisons, feel the crushing weight of adamantine chains designed to drain the life from beings older than human civilization. "Ignis," she whispered, and the name fell from her lips like a prayer for the damned. Deep in the Sierra Nevada's forgotten valleys, where human satellites couldn't pierce the ancient glamour that had hidden the elven realm since before Rome fell, the Heartwood Chamber erupted into chaos. The massive redwood that housed their council, a tree that had been ancient when Christ walked the earth, shuddered as if the very foundations of reality were cracking. The High Council materialized from their various dwellings across Eldoria, literally torn from sleep by the dragon's anguish. These were beings who had watched the rise and fall of empires, who had seen ice ages come and go like seasons, who had witnessed the birth of human language itself. Now they stood trembling like children, their perfect ageless faces twisted with horror. Aerion appeared first, his elemental tattoos already blazing with power. The ancient marks that spiraled across his arms and chest, runes of wind and earth, fire and water, pulsed with sympathetic magic as he felt Ignis's torment echo through the ley lines. His silver hair whipped around his face as raw elemental energy discharged from his skin. "The Sundering," he gasped, his voice cracking with centuries of carefully maintained composure. "By the ancient pacts, they're triggering the Sundering of the last." Faelan materialized next, his shadow-dancing abilities making his arrival more suggestion than substance. One moment the chamber was empty, the next he was there, his form still partially merged with the darkness between dimensions. His obsidian eyes that had learned to see truth in the spaces between light, reflected the horror of what he was witnessing through the astral plane. "The humans," he said, his voice carrying the whisper of wind through graveyards. "They don't understand what they're doing. They think he's just another specimen." Lyra was the last to arrive, and her entrance shook the very foundations of their sanctuary. The ranger's connection to the natural world was so profound that every plant in Eldoria felt her rage. Trees that had stood for millennia groaned as if hurricane winds were tearing at their roots. The aurora that perpetually danced through their hidden valley flared and twisted, reflecting the storm of fury building in her ancient heart. "They're killing him," Elara whispered, her twilight eyes bleeding silver tears that fell like liquid starlight. Slowly, deliberately, for science. The silence that followed could have stopped hearts, because every elf in that chamber understood the implications. The Codex Draconis spoke of the cosmic role dragons played in maintaining magical stability. If Ignis died in captivity, if his essence was corrupted by technological suppression instead of being released naturally into the ley lines, the magical foundation of Earth would collapse like a house of cards. Magic would die. Forever. "The non-interference protocols," someone whispered from the assembled council. "We swore sacred oaths." "Damn the protocols!" Lyra snarled, her composure finally cracking after centuries of diplomatic restraint. "They're torturing a god and we're worried about paperwork?" Aerion's elemental aura flared brighter, She's right. If we don't act, there won't be any protocols left to worry about. The humans will have succeeded where even the Dark Ages failed. They'll have murdered magic itself. Elara rose from her crystal throne, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of stars. Who volunteers for suicide? The question hung in the air like a blade suspended over their collective throat. Because that's what this was, a suicide mission against the most militarized, paranoid nation on Earth. 3 elves against Area 51. 3 immortal beings against a facility that had been designed specifically to contain the impossible. 3 hands rose without hesitation. Lyra stepped forward first, her ranger's instincts already calculating odds that would have made probability theorists weep. "I know human military tactics better than anyone," she said, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "If there's a way in, I'll find it." Behind her, Aerion's elemental tattoos began to glow brighter, wind and earth answering his call to battle. "The anti-magic fields," he said, his academic mind already working through the technical challenges. "I can disrupt them, but it'll require channeling more raw power than any elf has attempted in recorded history. I might not survive it." Last came Faelan, whose form was already beginning to blur at the edges, becoming one with the darkness that lived between dimensions. "Shadow walking through their security systems," he murmured, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "I can get us past their defenses, but once we're inside—" He shrugged, a gesture that somehow conveyed both resignation and deadly determination. "We're really doing this," Lyra breathed, and something between terror and exhilaration danced in her voice. "We're breaking into Area 51 to steal a dragon." The weapon caches of Eldoria hadn't been opened in 3,000 years. Tonight, they sang with ancient purpose as the strike team armed themselves with artifacts that could topple governments. Veil-weaving cloaks that didn't just bend light but convinced reality itself to look elsewhere. Focus crystals that could channel enough raw magical energy to level city blocks. Arrows tipped with sleep death, each one crafted by master artisans who had learned their trade from beings that predated human civilization. But their greatest weapon was desperation and love, and the kind of fury that could reshape continents. The journey across the human wasteland began at midnight, when the veil between worlds was thinnest. The elves moved like myths given form, their enhanced senses picking up every satellite sweep, every patrol drone, every motion sensor that crisscrossed the militarized desert. Each mile brought new dangers: infrared scanners that could detect body heat from orbit, seismic sensors that could pick up footsteps from underground bunkers, electromagnetic fields that swept the landscape like invisible searchlights. But these were beings who had perfected the art of moving unseen long before humans had invented fire. They flowed across the terrain like water, like wind, like the shadow of clouds racing across moonlit sand. When satellites passed overhead, they became part of the desert floor. When patrols swept the area, they were already gone, leaving only the faintest disturbance in the sand that would be erased by the next gust of wind. Mile by mile, the dragon's screams grew stronger. Mile by mile, their determination crystallized into something harder than diamond, sharper than obsidian blades forged in dragonfire. By the time they reached the outer perimeter of Area 51, Lyra could taste Ignis's blood in the air. The anti-magic field pressed against her consciousness like a physical weight, trying to crush the spark of eternity that lived in her elven soul. It was like trying to breathe underwater, like trying to sing with a hand clamped over her mouth. "This is it," she whispered, crouched behind a ridge that overlooked the Fortress of Secrets. "Point of no return." The facility sprawled before them like a cancer on the desert floor. Concrete and steel stretched for miles, punctuated by guard towers that swept searchlights across the no-man's land surrounding the base. Razor wire gleamed in the artificial light, coiled like serpents made of metal and malice. The very air hummed with electronic surveillance, motion detectors, and weapons systems that could reduce an intruder to constituent atoms in milliseconds. But what made Lyra's blood run cold wasn't the obvious defenses. It was the subtle wrongness that permeated the entire site. The way shadows fell at incorrect angles, the way the desert around the base was too quiet, too sterile, as if the land itself had been murdered. The way her magical senses screamed warnings about energies that shouldn't exist, technologies that violated the fundamental laws of reality. This wasn't just a military base. This was a wound in the world, a place where the natural order had been systematically tortured until it broke. Faelan was already moving, his shadow form slipping through the outer fence like smoke passing through a screen door. His abilities had been honed over centuries of espionage, of moving through royal courts and enemy territories without leaving so much as a footprint. But this was different. The anti-magic field made every step feel like pushing through molasses, every breath a struggle against forces designed to crush the supernatural. Aerion placed his palm against the earth, feeling for the technological heartbeat of the facility. The concrete and steel above couldn't hide the network of power conduits, the massive generators that fed the suppression fields, the intricate web of electronics that kept this prison of impossibilities functioning. His elemental magic, weakened but not destroyed by the suppression field, mapped every vulnerable point, every critical junction where a precisely placed surge of power could bring the entire system crashing down. And Lyra? Lyra felt something she hadn't experienced in her centuries of life. Pure crystallized hatred. Not the clean anger of righteous battle, but something darker, more primal. The kind of fury that had driven her ancestors to war against the forces of entropy, that had powered the great magic that shaped continents and moved stars. She looked at this fortress of human paranoia and scientific cruelty, and she wanted to burn it all down. Wanted to reduce it to ash and scatter those ashes to the winds until no trace remained that such an abomination had ever existed. The first guard never saw her coming. Neither did the second, or the third. These weren't kills. The elves had sworn sacred oaths against taking life unnecessarily. But they were something almost worse. Lyra's arrows found their targets with surgical precision, each one tipped with enchantments that would send the guards into a sleep so deep they would wake with no memory of the past 12 hours. They would remember nothing of the shadows that had moved through their patrol routes, nothing of the impossible figures that had passed within arm's reach of their positions. They moved through the facility's outer defenses like a virus, leaving chaos in their wake. Every step took them deeper into humanity's greatest secret, past laboratories filled with technologies that violated every known law of physics, past weapons that could rewrite the fundamental constants of reality, past evidence that the government had been lying about everything since the day it first learned that magic was real. But nothing prepared them for the moment. Faelan's voice crackled through their mental link. "I found him." The hangar stretched before them like a cathedral of nightmares, its ceiling lost in shadows that seemed to writhe with a life of their own. The air itself felt wrong here, thick with suppression fields and the metallic taste of enforced reality. Emergency lighting cast everything in harsh red shadows, turning their surroundings into a hellscape of twisted metal and incomprehensible machinery. And there, chained to a platform designed by sadists and powered by the systematic torture of ancient magic, lay Ignis, the dragon who had once scorched armies to ash, who had been worshipped as a god by civilizations that predated written history, was a broken shadow of his former glory. His obsidian scales, each one larger than a knight's shield, had gone gray with despair and systematic magical drain. His golden eyes that had watched the birth of galaxies, that had seen the first spark of intelligence kindle in primitive human minds, now held only the dull gleam of hope dying by degrees. The chains that bound him weren't mere metal. They were masterworks of perverted science, each link inscribed with symbols that hurt to look at directly. Suppression runes carved by humans who had learned just enough about magic to destroy it, feeding constantly on Ignis's life force, growing stronger with every heartbeat while their prisoner grew weaker. But when those ancient, suffering eyes found Lyra, something impossible happened. They flared to life. Not just with recognition, but with something that had been missing for 63 years of captivity: hope. "You came," Ignis whispered directly into their minds, his telepathic voice cracked with disbelief and wonder. After so long, I thought magic had forgotten me." The words hit Lyra like physical blows. In them, she heard decades of isolation, of torture, of systematic attempts to break not just his body but his spirit. She heard the doubt that had crept in during the endless years of captivity, The growing fear that perhaps the old alliances had been forgotten, that perhaps the world had moved on and left him behind. "Never," she snarled, her hands already moving to examine the adamantine chains. "We're getting you out of here. I swear by the stars themselves, we're getting you out." That's when the alarm started screaming. The sound cut through the air like razor blades, a harsh mechanical shriek that spoke of systems compromised, intruders detected, lockdown protocols engaged. Throughout the facility, blast doors began sealing with thunderous finality. Emergency lights bathed everything in bloody illumination as automated defense systems came online, their targeting sensors sweeping the hangar with deadly precision. That's when Aerion realized the true horror of their situation. The chains weren't just restraints, they were feeding on Ignis's life force, and they were programmed to drain him completely if the facility was compromised. Kill switches designed to prevent exactly what the elves were attempting. "The pylons!" Ignis roared, his ancient voice shaking dust from the ceiling and causing support beams to groan in protest. "Destroy the pylons or watch me die!" 6 massive energy conduits hung from the ceiling like technological spiders, each one pulsing with the stolen essence of dragonfire. They were the source of the suppression field, the heart of the system that had kept Ignis prisoner for over 6 decades. But they were also 40 feet above the ground, protected by force fields that could vaporize anything that approached them, and surrounded by automated defense systems that were now fully active and searching for targets. Aerion looked up at them, calculated the odds, and smiled like a man embracing his own death. "Cover me," he whispered, and began to dance with forces that could unmake reality itself. What happened next would be whispered in Eldoria for generations, passed down as legend even among beings for whom legends were historical fact. Aerion, calling on powers that should have been impossible within the anti-magic field, began to channel raw elemental force. Earth and wind spiraled around him in a maelstrom of barely controlled destruction as he reached deeper into the planetary energy grid than any elf had dared in recorded history. The first bolt of pure magical force struck the nearest pylon like a lance of crystallized lightning. The protective force field flared, held, absorbed the impact with mechanical efficiency. It held. It held. It held. Aerion's face contorted with effort as he poured more power into the assault. His elemental tattoos blazed so brightly they hurt to look at directly, and the air around him began to warp and twist as reality struggled to contain the forces he was channeling. Blood ran from his nose, his ears, the corners of his eyes, as the strain of pushing his magic beyond all safe limits began to tear his immortal body apart from the inside. Then Ignis, with the last fragments of his strength, added his own power to the assault. Dragon magic, older than mountains, fiercer than stars, wilder than the cosmic winds that shaped galaxies, joined with elven precision in a symphony of vengeance that made the hangar's metal walls ring like cathedral bells. The first pylon exploded like a dying sun, showering the hangar floor with sparks and molten metal. The suppression field flickered, weakened, and for the first time in 63 years, raw magic began to flow freely through the facility. Human soldiers poured into the hangar just as the second pylon erupted in screaming light. These weren't ordinary guards. They were specialists trained to deal with paranormal threats, equipped with weapons that fired crystallized reality, armor that could deflect magical attacks, sensors that could track supernatural entities through multiple dimensions. But they had never faced beings like this. Faelan's illusions sent them firing at phantoms, their high-tech weapons discharging uselessly at targets that existed only in their minds. Lyra's arrows found the gaps in their armor with surgical precision, each shot calculated to disable rather than kill but no less effective for the restraint. And through it all, Aerion continued his deadly dance with the pylons, destroying them one by one as his life force bled away with each devastating attack. The third pylon died in a cascade of electrical fire. Fourth. Fifth. As the sixth and final pylon detonated, sending shock waves through the facility's foundation, the adamantine chains snapped with a sound like the world breaking. Ignis uncoiled. The dragon who rose from that platform of torture was no broken prisoner. He was vengeance incarnate, ancient power unleashed, the living embodiment of every nightmare humanity had tried to forget. His roar shattered concrete, shattered steel, shattered the lie that magic could be contained by creatures who had learned to think only in terms of matter and energy. His wings spread wide enough to eclipse the hangar's emergency lighting, each membrane inscribed with patterns that spoke of cosmic forces beyond human comprehension. When he moved, reality rippled around him like water disturbed by a stone. The very air caught fire from the friction of his passage. "The roof!" Lyra shouted over the chaos of collapsing machinery and screaming alarms. Ignis didn't answer with words. He answered with fire. The explosion that followed carved a perfect circle through 50 feet of reinforced concrete, revealing the star-drunk sky beyond. The force of it registered on seismic monitors hundreds of miles away, sent shockwaves through the facility's underground levels, and triggered every early warning system in the military's arsenal. Fighter jets were already scrambling from distant runways as the dragon launched himself upward, carrying his elven rescuers toward freedom or death. The chase that followed was poetry written in contrails and chaos, a battle between the technological pinnacle of human achievement and forces that predated the formation of the solar system. Jets screamed through the night sky, their engines pushed beyond safe limits as they pursued a creature that shouldn't exist. Missiles bloomed like deadly flowers against Aerion's windshields, each one deflected by currents of air that moved with supernatural precision. Bullets passed harmlessly through Faelan's illusions, striking phantoms that dissolved on contact. And Ignis laughed. For the first time in 63 years, the dragon was free. Every wing beat carried him further from his cage. Every breath tasted of limitless sky instead of recycled air. The jets fell behind, their pilots' instruments screaming impossible readings as they chased a legend toward the dawn. When they finally landed in the hidden valley of Eldoria, when Ignis's claws touched ancient earth for the first time in decades, the dragon did something that made even the High Council weep. He collapsed to his knees and pressed his massive head to the ground in gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered, his telepathic voice broken with wonder. "Thank you for proving that magic, that love, is stronger than any cage." The rescue was over. The real war was just beginning. Because somewhere in the classified bowels of a government facility, bureaucrats and generals were realizing they had just lost their most valuable prisoner to beings they thought were myths. The cover stories were already being written. The hunt was already being planned. Task forces were being assembled, weapons designed, protocols rewritten. But in a valley where starlight still remembered the old songs, where ancient trees whispered secrets older than human civilization, 3 elves and 1 dragon began planning their next impossible mission. The weapons caches of Eldoria hummed with renewed purpose. The chronicles of Erthos were open to chapters that had been sealed for millennia. War councils convened in hidden groves where the very air crackled with ancient power. After all, Ignis had spent 63 years listening to every secret Area 51 contained. He knew about Project Chimera's other facilities. He knew about the other creatures, the captured phoenix in Nevada, the imprisoned unicorn in Colorado, the bound djinn beneath New Mexico's desert sands. And now it was time to set them all free. The age of hiding was over. The war for magic itself had begun.